I should also point out that you don't invite people to give a talk about birds because it's too broad a topic. So the topic of bees seems like a relatively simple one, but largely that's because of that we generally lack a lot of understanding of all the nuances, all the different species, all the different kinds of things that native bees are doing. So I'm not going to cover much in terms of the details. The details are lovely and wonderful. And as you'll see when I click the share screen, we have at USGS BIML is our handle, and we tell all kinds of stories and all kinds of details through our social media. And then if you're really interested, we can put you on our listservs and send you links to all kinds of the technical stuff that may or may not be of interest. So I am going to go to this talk here and click share. All right, I'm hoping that we're good here. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the relationship between plants and bees, and we're specifically going to hone in a little bit towards the end on the fact that many of North American bees, particularly the desert species, are highly specialized. And we'll talk about what that means when the time comes. Gosh, if I press this button, I should be going to the next slide, but yet it does not. There we go. Okay, I'm going to show a series of native plants. I'm not going to talk about what they are. These are mostly Eastern. We could be showing California ones too. I want you to look at architecture, color, and think about what you know about native plants in terms of time of bloom, time of day of bloom, what's going on there. And just with the realization that that architecture is there because those plants are in a way selecting for certain kinds of pollinators, and they are deselecting other pollinators that they would rather, well, actually other insects and sometimes mammals too, and other creatures that they would rather not come and raid their pollen and nectar. So nectar is a good example of something that has no direct benefit to the plant. In other words, it wouldn't produce nectar no matter what. It's all solely on the expense sheet for something that is required so that their preferred pollinators, which are often bees do most of the heavy lifting in these systems, comes in. So they don't want any old insect or mold or all kinds of other things, yeasts, to attack and degrade this nectar source. They want it only for those bees. Similar with pollen. Pollen in wind pollinated plants is a relatively straightforward thing, and it's designed to be light and blow all over the place, including up people's noses. But anything that has a colorful bloom is being designed to be attract insect pollinators. Yes, in some cases birds, the red colored tubular flowers, which we're not going to be talking about today. That pollen is heavier, is wrapped using what we would call pollen kit, which includes, importantly for bees, some high component of proteins, fats, and lipids. And internally, there's some more of that sometimes. But this is another big expense for the plants. So it really has created all kinds of systems. Again, entire books are written about this, that are designed to favor their favorite pollinators and unfavor everything else. So there's a lot of chemical components that are outright poisonous, or at least repellent to other species. They do things like swap pollen among bees. So I'm going to take bee species A and swap the pollen with bee species B. The young are the ones that are feeding on the pollen and nectar, and everybody dies. So bees are very specifically selecting pollen, and therefore all the chemical constituents of pollen, many of which have negative consequences to other species of bees that are intolerant of that. And thus we have these very specialized systems. And it also is going to mean that we are have to be aware of those when we are doing our plantings for bees, and also in terms of how we might be helping the environment, how we might be thinking about the value of our pollinator gardens and the value of our personal gardens and our personal spaces, which at one point were wildlands. So now, because it's much less common, I want you to also look at the architecture of bees. I don't have a scale here, but some, like the Perdidas, are extremely tiny. So a lot of bees, in fact, the bulk of the bee community out there numerically is about the size of a grain of rice or smaller. Perdita, in almost all cases, fits that description. And people are largely unaware of these because they don't give us honey. They also don't sting us, except in rare circumstances, despite their being numerically a huge part of the environment. So we did a back of the envelope estimation of the number of bees that are produced on an acre on average. So some more, some less in the East, and it came out to be 26,000 bees in a year per acre. So there's a lot, you're just not interacting with them in general. So there's a lot to learn. I'm going to point out, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but down at the bottom is the name of the group, the genus, in this case, Perdita, and the number of species in North America, not in California. We'll circle back to California. Number of bee species. So there's a lot, but I want you to look at things like, here's the tongue, whatever tongue means in the bee world. That is not the vertebrate tongue. There's all kinds of interesting things going on there. We could do an entire lecture on tongues, but look at these different sizes and shapes of the bees, the colors, and I think the matching beauty, although you don't have the resolution in your eyes to see many of these bee species, nor have you probably looked enough. Little butterfly binoculars are a help here. Coleoxys, 47 species. Eucera, 50 species. Again, everything you know about honeybees, we could spend at least that much time on each of the species, let alone the entire genera. Xylocopa, those are the carpenter bees, 10 species. Halictus, super common, 10 species. Anthidium, 35. Color, size, shape, look at the differences in where they carry their pollen, and just strange things that they have that you may not have noticed. The mandibles on this osmia, for example, are crazy large. So, you know, things are going on that in the bee world that are maybe different from our honeybee model. Some of the bumblebees, Striepulus is a nest parasite on other species. Here's a cactus specialist, Lithogopsis, Calides, cellophane bee, Melisodes, one of the big ones that are on Helianthus, sunflowers, and other of the mostly ericaceous, mostly Asteraceae in the season, Protoxia, lovely, I forget the name of the Western plant that is producing all that lovely orange pollen, but it's in the deserts of the Southwest near Arizona. So any discussion of wild bees, because people are usually starting from a pretty low level, we need to contrast it with honeybees. So honeybees, as was mentioned, are not native. They also are a very poor model for how to think about our native bees. So the easiest way to contrast the two is to say that anything you know about honeybees none of that occurs in our native species. No honey, no hives, no multi-year queens, no waggle dances, no barb sting. No one's allergic to native bee stings, and the list goes on and on. No waxy comb, all that kind of stuff. So it's easier to say everything in native bees is not what's in honeybees. Additionally, we have a sort of conflagration, maybe is a good way to talk about, but certainly confusion about what it means to save the bees or help bees. And a lot of times, because our minds rest immediately on honeybees and not so clear about these native bees, maybe they are honeybees. People are totally fuzzy about this. Let me just point out, honeybees have a whole series of problems, introduce pests, pathogens, strange organisms that have come in from other species of honeybees from around the world that have really harmed the honeybee agribusiness component of North America. So it basically is a lot more expensive to raise and manage honeybees. Costs have gone way up. You still can get pretty much as many honeybees as you want. You're just going to pay a whole lot more. Fortunately, most, with some exceptions, particularly in bumblebees, most of these problems don't cross over to the native bee part of the schedule. And honeybees have these disease problems that are going to have to be solved by better management of existing colonies. The industry, which is a pollination industry with some honey as a side benefit, and then a whole beekeeping culture surrounding amateur beekeeping, has to work very hard to maintain their colonies. However, the average person who is not involved in those activities, in other words, is not raising honeybees because they love them and are interesting, which they are, and that's why you would be in a beekeeping club, then you actually don't want any honeybee hives. Okay, so sponsoring putting honeybee hives on your property or on top of your building, or getting them into parks and those kinds of places, you are creating, I won't go too far down the tunnel of darkness here, you're creating competitors for all the native species. So you're not helping honeybees because they don't need more colonies. They need to work out, technical problems with how to deal with the diseases they already have. And you're introducing honeybees, which are super competitors because they're good at almost everything, into an environment that is not designed to have honeybees. So in general, honeybees are great in their place, which is mostly industrial agriculture and in beekeeping societies. And it's not something that you want to try to bring, particularly to natural areas. Okay, I'm going to get off that soapbox and move on. Plenty of places to answer and ask questions about honeybees, though. Magnificent animals. But chickens are magnificent birds, right? So bird watchers aren't releasing chickens everywhere. All right, I said I would stop, so I'm going to continue on. So in broad strokes, saving bees, by which we mean native bees, really means saving the pollen. So we're going to talk more about that. But all bees use pollen, even the parasitic ones are there, and pollen is involved as the protein source in all bee populations. So it's all about flowers. So when you talk about saving our native bees, it's about managing and creating pollen opportunities of the right kind. And that's where native plant societies can play a really invaluable role, particularly as they gear up and learn more about native bees. They can be advocates not only for native plants, which they've always been, right? I assume, but maybe not. But another big plus is starting to add some of these other groups that native plants provide the foundation for. So some of you, although it's primarily an East Coast thing, are aware of Doug Ptolemy's work on the support of native plants for birds, mostly. He does mention bees sometimes. But these same plant groups are supporting a very long list of other insects that are completely specialized and therefore dependent upon the occurrence of the native plants. So as we'll see, when you have something like willow, which we don't think of as blooming at all sometimes, there are a whole set of bees that only go to willow. Don't have willow, those bees are gone. So if you want to support bees that are in need of conservation, you're going to be supporting and working on your gardens and your production of specialist plants. And that's going to mean working with lots of different kinds of things. Who wouldn't like that? It's just capitalizing on that. Diversity of native plants is going to mean a diversity of native bees. You don't actually need to know that many details, okay? We'll have lists of specialist bees that are online now in the last couple of years that are going to be tremendously important. But at its barest minimum, if you are planting blooming native plants, you're doing something good, and you're probably 80% of the way to a complete, as good as it gets for your particular area. But you can always do better, and there's always things to learn. There's always things to think about in terms of integrating your yard and your properties and the municipalities with the surrounding landscapes and looking at what might be the, okay, the recording stopped and started. I guess I can ignore that. Okay, oops. I'm distracted because I'm also a co-leader of the whole talk. Okay, just some sort of cocktail things to think about. So roughly 5 flowers have enough pollen and nectar to support 1 baby bee. That covers all kinds of sins in terms of like the calculation, but it gives you an idea. It doesn't take much. 1 clump or 1 shrub in particular is a supportive act within the environment that you've placed that shrub, as long as it's geared towards native plant activity. So it doesn't take much. A container can provide enough pollen and nectar to support some part of the bee fauna in the area. Bees will figure out where to nest, so that's not as important as the fact that you are working and promoting native plants into these areas. And you can do the calculation, right? 5, you add, multiples of 5, you're adding 1 baby bee. So if you want to do calculator things, you could do a rough calculation on how many baby bees you've produced on your property, or increased or augmented. And also when you or your neighbor cuts down all of whatever it is, you can inform them how many baby bees they killed. There's positives and negatives to spin on some of these things. We talked about this. No one's allergic to native bees. So you don't have a stinging issue, which is often brought up as a problem. Honeybees have people who do have allergic reactions to honeybees, but in both cases, they're not defending floral resources. So at a set of flowers, even though honeybees will sometimes mob some of the native plants too, you haven't created a stinging problem, except for, I'm just going to stereotype little boys as creatures that will grab a bee, even though they should not have grabbed that bee, and they will get stung. So I would say it's on them, but in general, not a stinging issue. Hives, though, have stinging components. As you get into Southern California, you get actually into Africanized ones, another whole kettle of fish in terms of aggressiveness. Okay, so I don't have that many. I could bring in more specific examples, but again, I want to kind of cruise over at a general level here in terms of talking about bees. So just think about creosote bush. So Laria tridentata, it's the only member of the genus in the US, as far as I'm aware. You can see its distribution there, very deserty. A lot of you have driven through this kind of environment. It's just I don't want to stereotype bushes, but it's kind of a scraggly bush in a scraggly landscape. And a lot of people will be like, we could do better than that. We're going to clean that up and, pipe in some water and plant some better plants and things like that. But that species has 16 specialist bees that only go to creosote bush. No creosote bush, that bee community disappears. It's aligned with the local environment. These are the same arguments you're going to use when you talk about native plants, right? Creosote bush is there for a reason. It's adapted and spaced out in that way to harvest the scant rainfall. And it has ecologically all sorts of hidden benefits, many of which we don't even know, because who studies all the little leaf miners, for example, that might be inhabiting the green stems or the leaves at different times of year. And the bees are still an evolving taxonomic. So there's the current idea is that maybe as many as 1/10 of all the bees in North America are undescribed, and meaning they don't have a name. So you don't find that with birds. And the case will be even more so in lesser taxa. Again, pointing out that working with native plants in sync with what's going on in the immediate environments means that you are contributing back, repatriating in some ways, the landscape that was destroyed by the communities that you live in. So this is just one example. Here, for example, and I'm going to show you Jared Fowler's work in a second, because it gives you and someone should be ready to copy and put into the chat box, because I have forgotten to send that to the organizers, the URL for this. So you can look this up. So what you're looking at are genera of plants and the number of species of bees in the West. So the West is, basically the Rockies to the West. So a lot of this is a much larger number than simply California. Helianthus, for example, is not a huge component along the coast of California, but as you move to the interior, the Great Basin and other places like that, Helianthus is a rock star of a Asteraceae, and it supports tons of species. You can go down that list and you can see some of the ones that you're familiar with regionally. And the notion here is these are groups of plants that have co-evolved with groups of bees in a very tight relationship, so that there are bee species, the numbers are there as far as we know. And so this is probably a minimalist, but that of species relationships. So not only do we not know all the names of the bee species, the clarity we have about the relationship between particular bees and particular plants is murky. And we're learning some may not be so specialized, others are specialized, we've just not collected enough. So this is a good starter list in terms of looking at what you might be planting into your region in general, and which plant groups are highly supportive of native plants, of native bees. So at the family level, we're mostly talking about Asteraceae and Fabaceae, pea family members as having a large representation within this list. But as you poke around in there, you'll see lots of different groups and memberships in different plant families. So where is that list? So here's the list. This is compiled by Jared Fowler, who's done it for the whole US. And there's a Eastern, Central, and Western one. The URLs are of those three are pretty similar to one another. So, but if you get to one of his three lists, the other two are linked at the top. Might be slightly obscure. And what you have is on the left, and you can do some primitive sorting of these things. On the left-hand side are the bee species, and then has what states they occur in and their status, in general status. And then on the right-hand side, the genus. So we just don't know enough about species. So just because the genus is mentioned doesn't mean that that bee goes to any old member of Lupinus, for example, the first one. But these are the kinds of things. Often these patterns are broad enough that any dahlia might have a dahlia special honest. We're still learning tons, and taking pictures of the bees that come to your plants and posting them to iNaturalist is a contribution for just this sort of reason, in that some of these things aren't clear. From a native plant point of view, what I tell people is, when you're thinking about what should I be planting in my gardens, the idea is that there is no magical list that someone's going to hand you and say, you will save the bee world by planting these things. Look at this list and choose whatever makes sense for you and for your region from the specialist list first. So you want to be planting out Helianthus and some of these other particular groups. And because of the way things work, these are not uncommon groups mostly. So, and the reason for that is you can't have a really rare plant and have a bee specialized on it, because at some point the rare plant winks out in an area and then the bee is, left AWOL of its pollen plant. So in general, what you're going to find is a pretty good list of specialist plants for your garden. They're not going to be the super rare ones. I mean, there might be members that are super rare in the genus. All right, I'm talking too much about that. Anyway, work from this list first in terms of your planting notions, and backfill with some of the other plant species that are more generalized. A lot of the mints, for example, don't support specialists, although in the West, this may not be as much the case. In the East, it is. And also, I can think of a couple mint species in the East where they do have specialists, but these are the kinds of things. Some of the native plants that get lots of bees actually don't help specialists per se, but it's not that they should be eliminated from gardens. It's just that that wouldn't necessarily be the first things you do. Okay, here we are in the Bay Area and the surrounding habitats. It's huge, right? This is, we trivialize North America in lots of ways in terms of its relationship to all the exotic parts of the earth, but it is an exotic part of the earth. It is National Geographic level biodiversity and interesting things and cool stuff. We just happen to live there, right? So if we look at some of those relationships, California, 6,500 plants, about 2,000 species of bees, and more than any other state. There's only about 4,000 in North America of bees. So it's got half the bees, roughly, of North America. Most of the biodiversity of bees in North America, if you were defining hotspots, it's all in the desert areas, or the dry areas, I should say, of the Southwest. It's not in the East where you have lots of rainfall and lots of, a flush of plants. It's in the fact that you have in the desert Southwest, you have all the specialization, and you have all these basin and ranges and things that divide up the property into different biogeographic zones and occlude bees from moving around and plants from moving around. So more and more species, much higher specialization. Approximately 50% of the pollen carrying bees, and that might be all bees, about 20% of the bees in a region are going to be nest parasites. So I don't remember if the 50% is all bees or just pollen carrying, but it is more than anywhere else in North America. So not only is the diversity greater, but the specialization is greater, which puts more onus on you to think carefully about your planting strategies and to incorporate some of these plants that are highly supportive of specialist bee communities, and then start looking at them. Okay, another thing, in general, we don't talk about habitat per se for bees. We talk about plants and their associations with habitat comes from the plant point of view. However, the one exception is sand habitats, and this would be true out in California too. Here's an example, Jug Bay, it's near where I live. It's got wind-blown sands from the Patuxent River, and it forms, over millennia, big sand deposits, very dry, traditionally, for lots of reasons, from Indians to dry and fire and things. It was open, prairie-like, and deep sand, and there we have a whole series of very rare bees that nest only in those areas. And we'll talk about coastal areas to begin with. The analogs, although even more dramatically, would be imperial dunes, some of the other big sand systems, coastal sand systems too, and they don't have to be extremely extensive. So just a beach, for example, can have sand specialists along them in the back dune area. This thing, Epelis andrii, it's a longer story, but it was, when we first started out, Ben Hollister said he would collect some bees for us. He did. He caught 2 of these Epelis. At the time, we thought they were Epelis howardi, and then we sent them off to Tom Ornifurco, who was revising the genus, and he said, you know what? This is not Epelis howardi. This is a new species. And so he named it after his grandfather, I think. And side story, but anyway, the thing is, those are the only 2 in the entire world that have been identified. And he looked at every specimen of Epelis he could in North America. There was fortunately a male and a female, none others anywhere else. Does it mean only in Jug Bay does this occur? No, it's just a story indicating that sand is great because weird things show up in sand, and how little we know, because obviously you can't just have 2 bees, which you just killed, and think that that's the entire world population. There has to have been thousands, if not millions of them in the context of the region and the other area. There are so few people looking at this sort of story. I can tell you many similar to that. And some of the other species down there are similar stories of rarity associated with sand and very low specimen records because mostly people aren't looking. And if you're highly specialized on sand or plants and not in, that means that as a bee, if you're that way, you're not going to show up in an agricultural crop where most people are studying bees right now because that's where the money is, because people are concerned that honeybees will disappear. We are looking to native bees as backfilling on that. Not that they weren't already, but that's where the studies are. So these weird things that are showing up in natural areas are going undercounted, and there's new species to be found everywhere, particularly California. All those desert areas, all those perdita, 500 already, gosh. Dunes, we mentioned, we have a whole series, sorry there's no common names to these things, of species that are only in our coastal dune systems. Assateague Island is an example in Maryland, but all those coastal islands up and down the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast have a whole series of bees that are only on those dune spits. You have something similar, although I don't know the details, in California, but you have bees associated with sand. I believe there might be a species only found in imperial dunes. I'm not sure. Here is San Francisco. Oh, no, it's Baltimore Harbor. And these are the areas, these industrial areas, and Baltimore certainly qualifies as highly industrialized. We would think of as non-bee habitat. Just as an example of how wrong that is and how tough bees are, another guy and I did a day and a half of surveys in the Baltimore Harbor area in the middle of July, basically the worst time of year to sample bees. And we had 50 species, 11 happened to be not native, including a new one to the state, but, or it was in August rather. But it just shows that no matter where you are, there's opportunity to augment and increase bees. In some of these areas, including ones in these pictures, there are some quite uncommon bees, and many of them are native, and some of those natives are uncommon. And one thing you should know about bees is that they are awesome dispersers. So for example, in salt pans out west, people put traps out 5 miles out into the salt pan, catch bees out there. We have an example that's tied to Baltimore Harbor because the harbor has to be dredged. They created islands in the Chesapeake Bay 2 miles from the nearest shoreline. And we did a survey about 5 years after maybe it was more than that, but not that long after the islands were being created, and got over 100 species of bees in Chesapeake Bay. Maryland only has about 450 known species of bees. So they're tough, they're robust, they're everywhere. You build it, they will come. So urban areas, as Gordon Franke, your local child there, will tell you over and over, it's a powerhouse no matter where you go. However, your bees of conservation concern are going to be located in more naturalized areas, or you have to start planting the plants that they need, and they will move in to some of these suburban, even urban areas if the plants are there. They're not that picky. Just an example of interesting stories. There's so many. Here's Pickerel Weed. I don't know if it occurs on the West Coast, but there's 2 species in the East, maybe in the world, and it's out in the middle of marsh. They all disappear underwater in the winter. It's covered by ice. The bees can't nest there. There's the flag, right? Big purple stalk, big flowers. But the plant, so the flag says, come out here in the water. I have some really good pollen and nectar for you. It's purple. That signal is not a color in nature. except in flowers in most cases, right? Just think about nature, green, brown, that's it. Then colors, blue, purple, pink, flower colors, that's a very unusual and very attractive to us, right? Because of the unusualness. Neanderthals love flowers even, so they say. But they're a signal, so there's the signal. The florets have a very deep corolla, so you have to have a long tongue. So there's a predicate there for a bee, have to have a long tongue. And it turns out you need hooks on the hairs on the tip of your tongue to pull the pollen out of that. With all that, there's 3 species of bees that specialize only in Pontidaria, pollen, and they are from 3, I think, 3, well, certainly they're from 3 separate genera, and they might be 2 different families of bees even. And no pickerel weed, those bees are gone. So this kind of pattern is over and over. Okay, so here's your house. Just kidding. But basically, you are in a house. I'm in a house. That house at one point was some kind of lovely natural habitat. Might have been a long time ago, but it is not bee habitat now because there's a house there. Outside, this lawn is not habitat and is probably leading to, you know, the killing of everything else in the area because of what they spray on it. But think of native plants as, you know, your reparations for the things that you've done. Your driveway, not habitat, your sidewalk, not habitat. Those are the real decline in bees. The real decline in bees has to do with us flipping naturalized landscapes or natural landscapes and creating them and crafting them to meet our specs, which are mostly not about nature, and almost everything disappears out of them. So obviously you just do the calculations and you have huge declines going on in bees. What's going on in naturalized is a separate study, but you can bring back the landscape in some ways that was disappeared by your very own house by putting in some of these native perennials. And you don't have to replace your whole lawn, although that's encouraged. But think of it that way as you are giving back to what was taken away by your predecessors and perhaps even you. So, gosh, I'm on my high and mighty horse there. Here's an example. This is Southern LA or something down there of a native plant garden. You know how to do this. And you would choose a whole set of plants that would match the region's plants, and we cross-reference to that list. Many other bees, so for example, lots of plants attract bees, including lots of non-native plants. So sweet clover is a good example, magnet for bees. There's a long list of those kinds of things, many like zinnias and things like that, not necessarily native to the area. Mostly what those are, the analog would be bird feeders, right? So if I said, okay, we got a problem, birds are declining, they are, like everything. But my solution is put up a whole series of bird feeders. You would say, of course, that's silly. What about shorebirds and flamingos and, you know, shovelers? So but that's kind of where we are with a lot of the conservation actions. It's like, okay, we're going to save bees. Let's get out the wildflower mix from, you know, the store. So those do attract bees. There's actually no doubt. That's a positive thing, particularly if you're flipping a lawn to do that. The problem is it's not so much a problem. It's like you could do better. So what you're attracting are basically the crow and sparrow bees. So there'll be more bees, and a lot of them, most of them perhaps, will be native, and that's a good thing. But it's not a thing as a native plant society that you necessarily would promote per se, because you could say, well, we're going to plant some of these specialized bee lists. So the conservation value is low, even though you're increasing the number of bees. But these are bees that don't actually need our help, right? They're great with the cracks in the sidewalk kinds of weedy plants and all kinds of other things along highways already. You're just putting in more of them. just like when you would put in a feeder, you get a whole bunch of birds, including starlings and house sparrows and pigeons and other non-native ones too. Same thing. So specialist bees, as we just mentioned, they're the vulnerable ones, right? Those native plants, if they disappear from the environment, they're taking out not only these bees, but several other groups of insects, many of which we haven't even been described. So, like I said, 50% or so of the species of bees in Southern California would be highly specialized. And you have all these kinds of interesting relationships. Like here's a bee that only goes to native thistle plants. Actually, sometimes, like there's bull thistle, which is certainly a non-native plant on the agricultural hate list. But some of the thistle specialists are like, bull thistle, I can do that too. So there isn't necessarily this purity, because if you have a congener from another country, some of these of the plant that the specialist feeds on, sometimes they're okay with that. And other times it's like, it's not. So nothing straightforward in nature, is it? There's just another example. Evening primroses, why does it bloom in the evening? Because there's a whole set of bees that only come out in the evening when evening primroses bloom, and they specialize on evening primroses. And evening primroses, to pile on here, they have their pollen, okay? And it's weird three-cornered pollen there, pretty easy to ID if you're looking on the microscope, not that anyone does. But they're all connected by what are called byssal threads, which are really sticky, nasty things. So it makes the whole pollen thing difficult to handle for a creature, except for the specialist bees, which have specialist bee tools, let's call them, for carrying that pollen and handling this gummy stuff. And they indeed only come out in the evening. They even have specialized eyes, or the simple eyes on top of their head, to see in low light levels. So that's why evening primroses most come out in the evening. You have your pollinator plantings. This is right in downtown DC. And just to emphasize again that often these are a mix of things. You have things like lantana, not native to the area. What the heck is this tree thing called? Crepe myrtle. Some of these things do get bees, but a couple things. One is, the more derived from the native stock a plant is, meaning that the plant breeder is the primary driver for the evolution of that plant into, what the plant breeder wants, the less likely it has a pollen and nectar at high levels. So sometimes it's actually completely gone. Because why? Because the stock is being propagated vegetatively. There's really no need for seed and pollen and nectar to attract pollinators, because that's not part of the system any longer. So the plant, desperate to create bigger blooms or longer seasons or shorter stature or more robust stems, is going to take that energy from the pollen and nectar load. So the more derived the plant, native or non-native, doubling of blooms, all those kinds of crazy things, like, oh my gosh, look at that color of that echinacea. That is a signal that it's probably reduced in its usefulness to the native bees that might be interested in getting some pollen and nectar, because it's far enough removed from its original natural state. So in general, using what's the proper term? It's not nativar. It's I can't remember. The straight species is better. And so this is a mix. Here's what looks like to be some woodland sunflowers. Those are, have some native plants, but a lot of this is flowering plants that are attractive to bees, but they're loading with honeybees and some of the common halictids and things like that. So yes, bees good, but could be done better. All right, I'm wrapping up here. Bee nests. So people think about bee nests too, like, okay, well, I'm creating all these plants. what about places for bees to nest in? Depending on who you talk to, a relatively small, let's say, portion of bees actually nest in wood, like the mason bee kinds of things. Their creation of their nest is relatively simple. You don't need to buy a lot of things unless you want to. There's lots of fancy designs out there. Basically, you just get a drill, use a variety of drill bits. You get as long a drill bit as you can, but the regular drill bit sizes will work. And you drill out a hole a couple times to get all the sawdust out in anything made of wood. So you can drill your fence posts. I do my neighbor's fence posts, and I do my porch posts. No one notices any of these kinds of things. Scraps of wood, the ends, the sides of wood, you can pile them together. Another good source is common reed, Phragmites. You just create bundles of those, cinch them off every foot, take a handsaw, cut between, and now you've got a lovely bundle of nest habitat. The bees will figure out which of the stems to use. So in other words, you don't have to spend all your time cutting at the nodes and all that kind of stuff. Bamboo, people do that a lot. I'd say low return. Phragmites, Mycanthus, plume, pampas grass, those kinds of big plants are better. Just bundle them into chunks, cut them up. The bees will figure it out. Another hint is people get all uptight about cleaning up their garden or not cleaning it up. Most bee species that are nesting in plant stems can't break into the plant stem. So a tall, unbroken or uncut old plant stem in your garden has almost no value to bees because they can't get inside. They're not like carpenter bees who can actually drill through wood. Most of them have it's impossible. They need some entry point. And that could very well be that you cut everything off at the end of the year to a foot or 8 inches tall off the ground when you think that's appropriate. Again, we could go on and on about nest structures in different ways. So I'm an advocate for naturalizing your landscape. That's where I live. I have about an acre, and I'm constantly playing around because at the Bee Lab, we do that too with different plants and naturalizing the landscape. And I just use a weed whacker. So the weed whacker is really my plant editor. I make paths, I can swoosh them around. I see a tree seedling or too much honeysuckle or whatever it might be, and I just use the weed whacker to take it out. Now, I haven't dug it up, but you know what? Most people are lazy like me, and they're not going to dig it up anyway. So the weed whacker has turned out to be not as bourgeois as I used to think of it, as a really great tool. So I no longer have a lawnmower. I'm just sculpting my landscape in different ways. I also prune with it. So it's very crude, maybe not up to garden club standards, but you can roughly shape the whole lawn if you're not that picky. But the point is that it gives you a lot more freedom to play around with at least your edges of landscape. So I can put a brush blade, for example, which is a rotating set of a large cutting blade. And at the end of the year, I can come in at these edges of the woods and cut back the blackberries or do some really significant trimming back of shrubs, or take down all my perennials in large beds to that roughly 8-inch height. So when thinking about naturalized landscapes in a more suburban kind of place, people have done studies of this. So basically it comes to presentation. So any man-made object like the path or the house or the edge of the road or the driveway or the neighbor's fence needs to be tidily and neatly trimmed. So that's where, again, the string trimmer comes into play. And what you're doing is, particularly at the front of the house, is you're saying, I did this on purpose. It's clear that I'm taking care of my property. You may not understand exactly what I'm doing, but I can see that you're taking care of it. And I see that you have a really neatly trimmed sidewalk. That's a big deal. Fence really neatly trimmed. And like bees don't care whether you let the, the plants run right up to the sidewalk or not, but your neighbors do. And when you go on vacation, they will mow your lawn for you. So, but not if you do it this way. And it turns out that whatever these interstitial spaces are in the centers of your former lawn area are okay, because you did it on purpose, and you can add little paths and things like that. And then you can install pretty much whatever you want. But you do have to take into account what the neighborhood is like. Just a generalization here. EPA estimates 5% of all air pollution comes from lawn equipment of some kind. And I look at it as lawn equipment. If you're mowing the grass, you're mowing flowers, and you just do that calculation. Flowers divided by 5, or how many baby bees you've removed from the environment by that. So decreasing mowing, good thing. This is my last slide. There's my contact email. So I have more stuff. If you're interested, I can email you. We have Instagram, Tumblr, Flickr. That's where all these pictures are pictures that we've taken. Well, except for the ones that are landscapes. But the bees and flowers, they're all public domain. Our catalog is now well over 5,000 photos, I think. They're made by stacking photos together. So that photo, for example, is probably 100 different shots. And they're designed to both meet criteria for taxonomous, but also to look really good. And we want you to take them, and you don't have to ask permission, and you can sell them, and you can do kind of whatever you want with them. And the good thing about the Instagram account and the Flickrs to some extent, but particularly Instagram, and is that we tell all kinds of stories of some of the details of some of the things that we hinted at in this talk about the different shot, why we got that, why we were there, why we collected that bee, what's going on, some interesting side facts. So we encourage people to follow us to learn a little bit more. That's it. I don't know what time we have for questions or anything like that, but I can hang around for a bit.
Sam, this is amazing. Thank you so much for this incredible lecture. There is a lot going on in the chat. People have got all kinds of questions from people are really engaged with this. Can you tell us, are you aware of any native bees that use grass pollen?
Yeah, so that is a thing. So in Africa, Leoproces, it's I think a Halictidae group thing. They use grass pollen. And I don't know how the grasses feel about that, and whether that's a pollination system for them or not, or just thievery. But in the East, you get some use of grasses by a wide variety of bees, but most of the time it appears to be desperation. So the notion is that these grass pollens provide very little to no actual nutrient content. But so we don't know of any grass bee relationship that is at the level of specialization, or even providing so no grass species, for example, is known to provide in North America a significant part of a bee's diet. They do snack on it, let's say.
So, and we're talking native grasses, not just
any grasses.
Any
so
grass.
Corn, for example, big old grass, is sometimes has bumblebees, and honeybees will sometimes collect pollen from the tassels. But when it's tasseling, that's a really poor time of year for pollen producing plants. So, and those are colonial bees, and they're out looking for whatever they can get a hold of.
Where can we find out which bee species are most threatened in our area?
That is a good question. There's these, each state maintains a list of bees of concern, and there's, I'm trying to think of the name of the publication. Someone could put it in the chat thing. I'm sure they know. It's anyway, every 5 years, a state puts together a plan that includes what species they feel are vulnerable or threatened, irrespective of what the actual official mechanism for declaring that might be in a state. And almost every state, maybe every state, has bees on those lists. Now, that is just ones that made it to the list. So we know so little that we have bees that almost certainly are in trouble, but how would we know? Because we're not looking.
And we heard that there were some bees that were going to be listed as endangered in California, and that big agriculture blocked that listing. Is there any way that CNPS members can support these bees and making sure that they're listed and protected?
That might, I don't know the details. I'm guessing it has to do with Bombus occidentalis, which is a bee that did go down the coast of California and was in the Rockies. The coastal populations are gone. I believe the furthest south they are now is up in Seattle, and it has been a species that I'm not sure if it's been proposed yet, but it, if not, is just about ready to be proposed as an endangered species, or some category of threatened or endangered. I'm going to guess that it's not necessarily agriculture. I'm sure they're leery of it, but I think there's enough populations probably that it's probably not going to meet that threshold. We have one endangered bee in North America outside of Hawaii, and that's Bombus affinis right now. And I mean, that's very clearly endangered. And then others, we just don't know. There's some other bumblebees in play, that species that are mostly eastern, that are might go on, but they're nest parasites. So like the number of records are just handfuls. So yeah, it's a lot of this comes down to just lack of information. So that's why, solutions can come before the problem is identified. So again, planting and harboring, planting native plants within these groups, and harboring and fostering and cleaning up native habitats in your area is helpful, even if you don't know the details. And I can't give you the details.
You were saying with the Baltimore Harbor survey that there were 11 non-native species of bees. Do you have any idea how many non-native bee species are in the United States?
We do. We have a list. It's approximately 1%. I think the list might be up to 45 species now. I'm going to say there's fewer out west, but there's a whole slug of them. They seem to come in the east, and there's a slug that are making their way to the west. And sometimes, they pop up here and there already. So the trend, though, is for more invasives in the last few decades than in previous decades. So just like everything, we're very efficient at shipping. So it's going to be no surprise that we're getting more. There's an interesting, I don't know if it's still there, but there was in the Bay Area a little stingless bee, which is basically something that doesn't occur north of the US-Mexico border, that established in some community. Someone can maybe put in the details. But
it was Palo Alto.
Okay. And I don't know what its status is. Does anyone know if it's still around? But it was like a community, oh, we have to save these bees. But it's like, that should be in Mexico, not in San Francisco.
It was in the newest Bay Nature magazine. There was an article on it.
Mm-hmm.
And they are still in Palo Alto, though they have not found them outside the city limits.
Right. But is it still just that one tree hole colony, or was it?
No, I think they found a few of them.
Yeah. Right. C1 count 1,000 is, probably appropriate here. So might be too late.
Wow, interesting. Do you know if native bees are taking to native plants on roofs and walls in urban areas?
Yeah. So short answer, yeah. there was a study, I don't know if it's been replicated since because it was a number of years ago. And I think the answer was 16 stories. So above 16 stories, no bees seem to be able to figure it out, like how to get up there. But 16 stories and below, native bees find the plants. And the specialist bees are just like any other bee. If you have the plant is there, it'll find it.
Nice. Have you recommend, has anybody researched pollinator diversion by things like clover and impact on native plant reproduction that they need the bees for? Bees have opportunity costs for their time like everyone else.
I don't know the literature well. People have looked at that, and I don't know what the conclusions are. Like the notion would be, oh, I'm going to plant this super sexy plant here, let's say yellow clover or white clover, in the midst of a bunch of native plants that have, grubbed out their dreary little native plant lives for eons. And all the bees will be like, oh, we're going over to the sexy plant and we're going to ignore the native plant, and it will dwindle in its seed collecting or its ability to create seed. I think in general, that doesn't appear to be a big problem, but I'm going to say I don't know the literature well enough to be absolutist.
And really appreciate that reference to to Jared's work. Jared Fowler's work on the pollen. Some eagle-eyed CNPSer looked and did not see Ceanothus on it. And within the CNPS community, we tend to sell Ceanothus pretty hard in terms of having a lot of what looks like tasty pollen to the bumblebees. Any idea if there's Ceanothus specialists?
So Ceanothus is a plant that is okay, so I don't know the California ones, but in the East, Ceanothus is a dynamite bee plant, and also eaten by every deer that is nearby. But I don't think there are any Ceanothus specialists on the Eastern ones either, if I recall. You can do a word search. Jared's document is quite long. So when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, I sometimes have to go in there and like, is there anything on this particular genus of plant? I just do a word search. So, but wouldn't be necessarily surprised that there isn't any. One, it could be that there isn't. And two, it might be that no one has studied Ceanothus enough and the bees associated with it to look for specialization. Quick aside, there was a rare bee called Andrena rennie that hadn't been seen in decades. And then, truncating a long story short, it was one of these fun things that we love when we find it. It turns out it's a chestnut specialist. So American chestnut disappeared. Its congener, which is chinkapin, was around, and we found it on one blooming chinkapin, and then was like, maybe. And then we looked at the literature. Oh, it has shown up on the Chestnut. And so then we started looking at these American chestnut little groves where they're trying to bring back chestnut, and darn if it wasn't there. And so that was staring at everyone right in the face for all these years, and no one figured it out. And so Ceanothus, maybe it does, and no one's figured it out yet.
Wonderful. We have a few people who have been concerned that they're noticing lower numbers of bees in their gardens this year. If there's any way to determine if there's a local phenomenon or a wider phenomenon.
That is tricky. You have both the problem of bees fluctuate from year to year. And so maybe it was a bad spring, and bad springs certainly have an impact in terms of how things get rolling. A lot of bees you see in your gardens, bumblebees are a classic, but you have other of the small bees that are out all year round. They build up their populations and have a primitive sociality, let's call it. So they can be impacted by weather, and they could be impacted by weather last year. So, and then you have just your observability. Maybe you didn't look on the day that had all the bees on the one big blooming plant that you were there last year. not gonna say that's the case, but we see that all the time. And I can't even tell in my garden, except unless the changes are monstrously large, because I don't trust myself as an observer.
Good point. Yeah, one of the things that we recommend, because we can garden all year in California is, or at least coastal California, is to try to make sure to have a continuous bloom of native plants. So we do have a long blooming plant list on on the CNPS website in the biodiversity resources. We're being asked, how can we support more native bee research?
You know what the limiting factor is for native bee research? First of all, I should say the current administration is incredibly favorable. Like, all the agencies are just in the throes of joy over increased pollinator efforts, and there's all kinds of meetings and so on and so forth. The problem is, who can identify those bees? And so everyone has the same problem, which is that at the most base level, where you're trying to figure out rare bees, or you're trying to do community analysis, not just like, I've got a bee, I'm just going to count the number of bumblebees, I don't care which species. When you get down to the species level, it gets super tricky. Like I mentioned, 10% of the species are thought to be unnamed, and that means that it's tricky to name them, right? Or we would have found them, and no one's looked. And someone needs to be paid to do that. And that's the, I would say right now, the biggest problem and the biggest conservation need, which is to support people to learn how to identify their bees and, make that into some kind of job, either something that they could support themselves by doing, getting paid to identify bees for other people, which is a thing, or better, and I should say, putting people back into museums, because that's where all the bee work originally was done in terms of describing species in museums, and most museums have been trimmed all up, like no more curatorial staff, all kinds of things. And then we're like, oh gosh, what about those rare bees? Why don't we find more? It's like, how are you going to do that, right? Who's going to identify them? What happened to the collection that had all the rare bees in it? Gone and gone. And it takes years to learn to do that to create that kind of skill. It's not impossible at all, but that's the problem. Everyone now loves pollinators and wants to study them, and they're all stuck because it's like, we don't know what the species are in most cases. Like, learning, even if they're described, still figuring out how to take the bee that you have found and putting a name on it is, there's so many meetings where the graduate student or the program director of the state has all these grand notions, and then they can't find anyone to do the identifications, or they do it at a very, like, at the bumblebee level, like, oh, we found a bunch of bumblebees and we'll count them, but they may not even be bumblebees, because there's other things that mimic bumblebees, Anthophora, for example.
What's the best source for new bee research? Is there a bee academic journal or a website?
So I'm not gonna know really what to look for in California. I think you might Google around, and people in the chat room should throw out some ideas there. You can email me and I can put you on our bee monitoring listserv, and that gives you a little more on the technical side of things. There is another listserv which the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign runs, called Pollinator-L. So you can look that up, and that has more general announcements about bees and native bees in it. And those would be the two email-y sources of information. Xerxes Society is basically our biggest invertebrate conservation group. So they have lots of bee stuff going on, and they are based in the West, Seattle, I think. So I would look up the Xerxes Society, and you'll learn an awful lot through them.
They're very helpful. We've got a question from someone. They work near a big, beautiful buckeye tree, the Aesculus californica, and there's a honeybee hive nearby and an olive tree. The honeybees are foraging on the buckeye, but she's read and I've heard that the buckeye is poisonous to honeybees. Why do they forage there anyway?
I don't know enough. So maybe they're poisonous to honeybees, maybe they're not. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. I don't know either way. It could be poisonous. It could be poisonous under some circumstances. So for example, if the colony is weak, it could whack them, and it may have to do whether they're topping off the nectar or the pollen. So I'm not clear as to what's going on there.
And a question about some of the bee hotels available commercially. They might not be good because their tubes are too short. Do you have any recommendations about what to look for in a commercial bee hotel?
Yeah, there's a notion that a bee, let's call it hotel or hole or nest thing, should be 6 inches or more. That's not, I wouldn't worry about that actually. And the reason for that is that the 6 inches or more thing comes from the people who are raising hole nesting bees commercially. So there's a market for within the orchard industry and within the alfalfa industry, different set of bees. And they have worked out a ton of nuance because they have the problem that they have to, their product is bees and they have to have a lot of them. The homeowner is less beholden to making a profit off their bees. So we've done some tests, and holes that are short tend to be occupied at a lower rate than holes that are long. We haven't measured whether their next success is lower. With osmias, there's a notion that short nests are mostly males, but in the end, you know what? No matter how many holes and nests you're doing, you're going to have relatively small impact on the overall population and stability in future years. So if you have a commercial nest thing that's short, I would use it. If you have an option, I would make your own hole, and then you can make it as long as you want. But I wouldn't worry too much about it.
And Leslie Salgershins is on, and she is saying that on iNaturalist, Jonathan Asher, who is a bee identifier, looks at photos of bees. He's looked at some of mine, and he's identifying, or at least attempting to identify, our bees on iNaturalist, not getting paid for it, and we all really appreciate the work he's doing there.
Yeah, so John's a powerhouse of identifiers. Yeah. He loves doing that kind of thing, and yeah, we all benefit from John's work. In fact, a lot of us who might be on iNaturalist like, why bother? Because John's doing them all. So, but John is a special case, and so a couple things. One is bees on iNaturalist, sometimes most of them are unidentifiable in certain groups, like, oh, the picture doesn't show all the characters. And so John really can squeeze out some really cool examples of bees, but it's not a complete portrait. So I encourage people to put up their bees, that particularly on some of these specialist plants, but it's only a partial list, because a lot of times you're looking at the depth of the suture line on the back leg, or these kind of microscopic characters that aren't going to show up in a picture. So we like John and want him to do more, but he's up against a wall in a lot of cases.
There's a question, there's a Facebook meme about spreading dandelions as being good for the bees. And this person's trying to keep her property native, and they're inundated by these Facebook memes. Where did this idea come from, and how can we stop it?
Well, I wouldn't worry. Again, it's one of these things. I wouldn't worry about it too much. So if if the average homeowner choice is the kind of lawn you saw in that photo, or that lawn with some dandelions, that's a good thing. Dandelions are basically like bird feeder kind of stuff. So a lot of, it'll get a lot of bee forage, and I've collected some native bees off it, but they're back to, what are those native bees? Basically crow and sparrow native bees again. So dandelions, first of all, where do dandelions occur? They occur mostly in highly disturbed human habitats. They're not usually that common out in these naturalized areas, so much that we have plenty of other problems to worry about. So yeah, I'm not cultivating or not cultivating. I'm pulling any dandelions that are in my native plant beds. It's a weed, and many weeds support some kinds of bee activity, but you don't see people going like, oh, we need more of that prickly sow thistle. It's supporting lots of bees too, but it's ugly as sin. So it doesn't get the same coverage, but the idea is the same. So I would get rid of dandelions in places that you care about, and I would ignore them elsewhere. And I don't know anyone who really, like, what kind of damage could you do with, who even plants dandelions? Is that maybe it's gotten out of control in California?
Don't start me with some of the things that are being sold to promote bees that are invasive. Fumaria is invasive.
I would worry if people are creating, but maybe I wouldn't. Like, what if there was a lawn mix that included dandelion seed? That would be kind of interesting.
The future.
So you could look at it as like softening people up, like better than just, killing everything but the grass, I guess.
It's true. So a lot of us in urban and suburban areas, when we see bees in our native gardens, we not only see native bees, but we also see honeybees. Should we be dissuading the honeybees? And if so, how?
It's really hard to do anything about it. If you have a hive, you're in control, right? But if you're in a garden and all your neighbors have honeybee hives, you're stuck. You really can't control them. I mean, the only thing you could do is if the municipality is putting them into parks. I mean, the arguments can be made that that's inappropriate, and they just may not be aware, because, hey, why not have honeybees? It seems like a good thing for a lot of people, right? Even my cousin, at a family reunion was like, Sam, hey, guess I know you're into bees. Guess what we're doing? We're hiring a person to bring a hive to, and I'm like, oh my God, I had to bring them down. They were so thrilled to tell me that they were helping the bees out. And that's what most people's attitude is. So you don't want to, it's hard to be too negative about it. But if you just have lots of honeybees in your garden, I have that sometimes at certain times of year on certain plants at the lab even, and we're miles from human habitation. So I don't know that you can do anything about it.
Okay. Maria just trimmed her Sambucus, and she's got a lot of long, thick 1.5 to 1 inch diameter stems. Can she trim them and bundle them to help provide habitat? Or is it only good with woody stems?
Yeah, so Sambucus, so elderberry is actually interesting plant because it's not hollow, unless there's a different California one, but I don't think it's so. It's pithy though in the middle. And there's a set of bees, Ceratina, which are minute carpenter bees, although they can only mine pith, that will move in. So basically take your Sambucus stem cuttings, bundle them up and place them wherever you want really, but mostly you would, tuck them next to the shed or under the eaves or something like that. And bees will find them and drill out the pith. Or sometimes you can bundle them up closer to the ground, the better, because that's where most of the bees are flying, at flower level, not way up in the rafters of your house. I should correct that. But yeah, they're good. And so are blackberry and raspberry stems.
We have thimbleberry and salmonberry and a California blackberry here that are native. So a lot of us have this.
All the brambles.
Leaves are wonderful for caterpillars. One last question. How far can native bees fly?
Depends on the bee. So, it's kind of a body size thing. So I think the estimates are for bumblebees about 2 miles. So honeybees are the champions. I mean, people talk about regularly, I think that the colony will exploit good food areas 2 miles away. But most bees are homebodies. So, and they're solitary, right? So female crawls out of the nest, doesn't have an app about where the good plants are, and it just starts flying. It might do some circles initially, but then it's just going to start dispersing until it finds what are the proper plants. That's why they're good dispersers, right? Because if they don't find the plants, they're going to start flying somewhere. And apparently flying over water or over desert pans doesn't register as maybe a bad idea.
Wow. All right, one last question. Someone is very concerned. They've got a lot of native plants. They've also got some rosemary bushes. There's a honeybee hive a few blocks away. Should they remove the rosemary?
I would say don't bother. So rosemary, not native, but it's rosemary. So, herb gardens often have lots of bees. They often have lots of honeybees because a lot of those herbs are Mediterranean and therefore in the pocket of honeybee, cultural resources that they exploit. So, unless you're really tight for space in your garden and you would like to put in something more native, and replace that, if it's just like just to get rid of it because it's mostly having honeybees, I wouldn't bother.
Okay, sounds good. Sam, it's midnight your time. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us here on the West Coast and with the California Native Plant Society. This has been incredible and I've learned so much. Thank you to so many of the experts who are also on the line who are adding information to the chat. And we'll be able to get a hold of you and follow you on Instagram, will we not?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Glad to help. Okay.
Good night.
Good night.